It's a pleasure, Sindhu, to do this here in my hometown, Bangalore. And I must say that, I started reading the Mahabharata when I was very young, really young. I loved the stories. And in the Mahabharata, as you all know, men turn into women, women turn into other things, other beings. There is all kinds of love, and there's a fluidity of all these characters and their identities. And I grew up with that till I met the adult world, which had so much problem with all of that and wanted to fix and put us in these little boxes. And I wondered why this was. And not just that, it was said that all these other feelings that one had about being queer or being different um, were not Indian culture. It all came from outside. So, Sindhu, your book is like a big tight slap across everybody who ever said that. So, thank you for writing it. Let's dive right in. Your book argues that in the pre colonial time, India had a rich, diverse, and often fluid sense of identities and genders. The British came, they got very scared, and they got scandalized. And then they set up a series of Victorian laws and morality. They pathologized these identities, they criminalized them and tried to erase. Why did the British find it so abhorrent? What was it? What ticked them off so badly that they had to do this whole rampage to these different kinds of identities in it?
It's lovely to talk to you, Arundhati, as always. And thank you, BIC, and all of you for being here. So this is a long story. So I'll tell you the short version. So the thing is, when the British first came to India, I'm talking about, they were called the Romantic Orientalists in the beginning. So when they first came to India, they were found it so exotic and beautiful and, erotic and all of that. So these men would take up, Indian wives, native wives, so some would have them as lovers, some would, and it was not like all these, they were not all exploitative relationships, right? Because they would actually fall in love. There are all these poems written about them, and how these stories of Englishmen having these great love affairs with Indian women. And this was across society. It was not just the sort of big officers doing it. Even the soldiers were falling in love with, women of a middle or working class sort of backgrounds, right? So this was all happening. This is how the Anglo-Indian communities were formed back then. So this, right. And the British Army encouraged this. They said, take local women, so we'll know more about, take them as wives and lovers, so we'll know more about local culture. So this was in the beginning. And so everything existed. So people could be queer then, people could be, trans women existed then, in their communities. All this was accepted because they just come into India. And the interesting thing is,
and also, they didn't bring their women at that time.
No.
The women didn't want to
that
come to this hot and humid country.
Yes,
yeah.
That happened in the 19th century. So this was in the beginning. And then what happened was that British soldiers started getting syphilis, right? And then the British got really scandalized. They were like, and they were taking off work a lot, right? And so they wanted to know who are these British soldiers having sex with. And they started looking, asking the soldiers, because they already had sex workers registered as sex workers. They would come voluntarily and register themselves. But that's not where they were getting the syphilis from. They were getting the syphilis from other women in society. Then the British started getting interested in, understanding how these sexual mores were in India. So they would go dig up, find out, send spies to go see what's happening, who's having sex with who in this society and all of that. And they were super scandalized, because this is the Victorians we're talking about, right? In Victorian Europe, in England, women showing their ankles was considered improper, immodest. So that's the people we're talking about. And India was just pretty open at that time and libertine in that sense. So then they discovered that women were having sex outside marriage, women were having sex without marriage. All this, women were polyamorous. All this was common across strata in Indian society. And the thing is, the British soldiers wouldn't name the women they were sleeping with. So then they had to class entire communities as, oh, all these women are prostitutes. So they had these prostitute registers. So any woman who was not a monogamous upper caste Hindu wife was considered potential prostitute, right? So courtesans, singers, everybody. Then they found out that some of these women were having same-sex relationships. Some of these courtesans would have same-sex relationships. And obviously for the British, that's like something to titillate them, right? So they don't think, oh, if two women are together, it's not because they're in love. It's not because they desire each other. It's because they're trying to get the British to think, oh, come have sex with me, you know? So it's that's how they saw it. And the biggest hidden history in this is that it's not just the women that the British were so excited about. The British would often get excited by Indian men as well. So a lot of British soldiers in the beginning were lashed and sent off to Australia because they would have interracial homosexual relationships with natives in India. This is the deep in the archives, like really hidden. Um, and that's when they had to bring in all of these laws, because how can they colonize a country if everyone's just falling in love with everybody else, you know? So they had to bring in Section 377 and stop, because it was like a thing. So by the way, going native at that time was code for interracial homosexual relationships. So if a British guy came here, he went native, it meant, oh, okay, you know? Yeah, so this is what happened. And then 1857 happened, obviously, and after that, everything changed. And then the British started categorizing Indian society, right? Like who's a man, who's a woman, and they're really scandalized. So the Victorian era, by the way, is called the age of gonads. That's what academics call it, because that's when they started categorizing sex. So they would they would literally, they made everyone strip, show me what's under your skirt or your pajamas or, whatever, because people were dressing how they liked. They were not dressing according to how we think they dressed back then. So yeah, lot to unpack. Yeah. So they were really scandalized by everything about us.
And that's when they decided that no, we must make them all straight jacketed into this. So I had known of Sindhu, of you as somebody who wrote storybooks. You have 2 books of short stories. How did writing this book happen? I mean, was it like a personal incident, some catalyst, and how did you dive deep into these colonial archives and found these gems from there?
Okay, there are two parts to that answer. The first is that I was a dysphoric queer teenager growing up in India when Section 377 was still very much present. So I was told I was a criminal, that this was not Indian culture, I'm like bringing shame to the family, all of that stuff. So then I wanted to prove to them that, actually, this is, I mean, I had the hints, right?
This is very much our culture.
Yeah, so I wanted to prove to, the family. That was one part. The second part of the thing was that I was, when I was doing my PhD, this is from my PhD, all the research from my PhD. When I was in the UK doing my PhD, I wanted to write a novel about this particular time period. So then I was digging the archives to find queer traces of, in that time period. And it was like it was not very, I didn't go into the archives thinking I'm going to find this stuff. But then when I started digging and digging and digging, I'd see there's so much research about this already done. And the British academia knows about this history of ours, that, all of this existed back then, and how the British criminalized all of these identities and these realities. And India's stuck in post-colonial amnesia. We don't know about it. So I was just like, what's going on here, right? So I would dig the archives, one thing would lead to the other, and I'd find it in the weirdest places. Like you'd find missionary texts talking about this. You'd find obviously legal, medical texts talking about it. You just find it everywhere. And then I'm thinking, how are we even saying that this is not Indian culture? Like the whole idea in India is that all this is Western and, we're trying to ape the West or whatever. But actually, this is very Indian in that sense. India was very queer in that sense.
And so I want to have this conversation with Sindhu, moving back and forth between what is in the book and how the book is written and her own research as an academic. So it'll be fun to do that and not just only talk about the book. So I'm very intrigued by this word stole that you have used in the title. I mean, you could have used something like suppressed, or even I wrote down some words, erased, words like this. But this act of stealing, why did you want to use this, and how does it impact what you've written?
This was something that came up in conversation with my editor, that we came up with this together. But the reason I went with it is because, like in the West right now, for instance, it's considered, like it's okay, it's normal to be, not really in the US so much, but it's considered to be a Western idea that we are so progressive, we're so liberal, we are queer, we are like all of this. And India does not think that. Like India thinks these are, So the interesting thing is that all of these ideas were from here. So, they stole it. And when they stole the past, they also stole the future. Because with all this legislation that they brought in, which India is still stuck with, and the morality that we have, which is also Victorian morality that we are stuck with in India, they all sort of moved on, but India is still stuck. So they sort of stole the past and they stole the future by stealing the past. This is something that I always say, that the present moment is always connected to the past and the future, because what is happening now determines the future, and what's happening
It's
now
sort of the now is like a hyphen between.
exactly.
Yeah,
So it's connected to the
yeah.
past. So that's why I said stole
Stole.
futures.
Actually, the image that I had got was as if a European museum has put up an exhibition saying these are the things we didn't steal, and the room is empty. It felt a bit like that, when I was. Okay, let's move back. Let's move back to the colonial times. So we all know about Article 377. Many of us here have participated in the protests, in the marches for years, and it has been a very difficult struggle for the queer community in India, because even the courts kept going back and forth, and we don't know again when it's going to change back. So it's not something that it's already a completely won battle. We are at the same time, that's the only one that strikes us as like we all know about. But in the book, you talk about not just legal, like not just laws and legal imperatives, but many other ways in which the British tried to control sexual identities as well as gender identities through almost like an oppression on society. Do you want to talk a little bit about what are these other ways that we don't necessarily see or know of?
I think, okay, obviously we know about the legislation. We know how CTA, the Criminal Tribes Act, criminalized trans women. I told you briefly about the, lock hospitals and how they would, put all women they considered to be prostitutes in there, which also included homosexual, bisexual, polyamorous, all sorts of women. So those are some of the medical ways in which they did it and legal ways in which they did it. The other way was to check which sex a person belonged to, and whether cross-dressing was a big no-no, right? And because of the cross-dressing was considered criminal, right? So because of that, and the interesting thing is, in that time period, according to the archives, it was not just male-bodied people who were cross-dressing. It was also female-bodied people who were cross-dressing according to them, which was very normal in that time period. But then all that was criminalized by the British, because if they did that, then they'd be suspected of either being homosexual or a prostitute. So those were some of the things. But what's also very interesting that I found very fascinated by, and like what impacted us, is that there was a major erasure in our literature, in the native literatures, as in like Urdu poetry or Sanskrit poetry, Tamil, Bengali, on all of these languages, because all these guys were trying to please the British masters so much, right? So and all anything that was considered erotic, anything that was homosexual was dirty, vulgar, below, primitive, according to the British. So to stick to those standards, which considered only monogamous, heteronormative, love to be normal, right? So all this was deviant according to them. So there was a major purge in that time period, which natives themselves conducted upon themselves, on their own literatures, in Urdu, Persian, Sanskrit, all of these, Bengali, Tamil, all of them. And that is when we lost a lot of our own sort of knowledges and histories of this, of these memories. And what we have now is post-colonial amnesia. So we don't remember that this existed because it's all mostly gone, but some of it's still there.
And you talk about those traces and how. So we'll come to that. But since we are talking about this that there is one section of Indians who actually enabled this process of erasure, and I can't think of like a sort of a better way of saying this, but saying that this must have been something to do with caste as well. Because you talk about that very clearly in the book, page after page, where you mention how caste and class were very much part of the scenario of this, the gender fluid, sexual fluidities that you're talking about. how caste and class played a deep role in some of this. And you mentioned incidents, you mentioned kind of how they impacted how people would live, and as well as Brahmanical patriarchy actually siding with the British and saying, and sort of trying to purify everything that was here. So just like tell us a little bit about what you found about the caste angle specifically.
Yeah, so like you rightly said, it was the puritanical Brahmin Pandits and the Islamic Maulvis who were also fundamentalists who were willing to help the British in this purge, obviously, because they shared the values of the sort of Victorian Christian, morality in that sense. And so what happened in this was that the monogamous upper caste Hindu marriage, which was applied to the sort of especially Brahmin, marriages, was sort of applied to the rest of society. Although the rest of society was not like that. They were fluid in the sense that different castes and communities and languages, I mean, wherever they're coming from, they would have different practices. Everything was not this one, thing. But what happened is because they saw everything through this lens of the Brahminical sort of lens, the Brahminical patriarchal lens, then a lot of women and men in Indian society were considered outside of that, or they were deviant, right? So these Brahminical pundits, these puritanical Brahminical pundits would help the British identify all of these people. So like there are specific examples, for example, in the Lock Hospital records, you find these women, who is told by this upper caste dude that these subalternized women are sex workers or prostitutes. But they send petitions saying, no, we're not. This guy is saying this just to, take out personal revenge on us or whatever. But then because these guys who are employed by the British said so, they are registered so. But these two women in the book I cite, they actually petitioned again and again and again and got their names out of the register. So these instances also happened, but most of them couldn't. So they would just be put in, right? So caste played a big role in that sense of who was identified as what, who was respectable, who was not respectable, according to the prisms that they created. And similarly, in the Islamic universe, if a woman did not belong to a patriarch, if she was an independent woman, she was considered problematic and potentially a prostitute.
Lose morale.
Lose morality. Right. So this is what they helped with. Who has loose morality and who doesn't. So caste played a big role in deciding that. The Brahminical patriarchs decided for everybody else whose morality was respectable and who was not. So
and there were, you talk about a lot of, and this is very, very disturbing because in some ways one sees it even today, especially in the kind of political environment that we live in today. There's a lot of spying also, and people sort of spying and then informing about others that they think are deviant. And I also want you to talk a little bit about maybe this word deviant. Was there an idea of deviance before, or was that the idea of deviance came with a certain colonial value system?
See, this is the thing about history that you have to read with nuance, right? Because anything we say about, like somebody said this, everything you say about India is true and it's also not true. So anything we are saying about the past, it doesn't mean everybody was like this. So there were always these fundamentalist types who are going around trying to say this is the only way you can be. But this is to say that people were always resisting this in the past and living the way they wanted to live. Always finding ways to say, you know what, F you, I will live the way I want. So this is what was going on in the past. And what you say about these, specific instances of how they did this. And can you say that again? What
The spying bit that
the spying bit. So the Lock hospitals is where you see the spying bit a lot, and with the police trying to find those who flouted Section 377 with men, right? So there is this funny quote. It's not really funny now in retrospect, but there is a thing in the medical jurisprudence of India. It's like a mid 19th century thing, which says that if every person convicted of homosexuality in Bengal is put in the prisons, the prisons would be overflowing. So this is actually said, like that's an actual thing. So which is why they would not, go and incriminate everybody. They would just threaten them because then they don't have space to put everybody in prison. And with women, it was like spying, like, like say a neighbor looking at, oh, that woman's very close to that other woman, or like, she has too many sexual partners. All of these things would be used as, evidence against her morality. So, and then that means she can be she's a prostitute. So
again, she gets categorized into.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So this is how it happens. And the interesting thing is that caste plays a role in this too, right? So you see how the entire pyramid participated in it. So what happens is that you see all the intellectual types, the intellectual puritanical types, they go into the fundamentalist books and they tell you theoretically who's a prostitute and who's not. Like, you know, who's according to the sacred texts, obviously the Manusmriti and all of that, who is a prostitute and who's not according to that. And then in the reality, you see all these working class men and these peons and gumastas and inspectors going and prying and spying on all, you know, women and being like, oh no, she's the one, she's the one. So it's like you see all men participate in it from the whole spectrum, right? So it's all about them categorizing. So yeah, it was horrible.
And you know, you found so much evidence of this fluidity of queerness which was there. What are some of the things that really startled you, and if I can say also made you joyous that okay, this is there? What were some of those finds? I mean, you talk so much about not just cross dressing, but also how masculinities blossomed in women who were identified as women, while on the other side it was okay to be feminine for those who were identified as men. And these categorizations weren't as straight jacket, etc. There's many beautiful things that you've discovered. Share with us a couple that really like struck you as amazing.
Thank you for that, because honestly, this was a work of queer joy for me. You know,
Yeah,
so there's so much, obviously, the pain and the suffering of it, which I talk about, but not in graphic detail, because the joy was what I was holding on to, because this is what I wanted to tell everybody, that this is actually there. You know, this is our history. So, as you say, you have petitions that women, or as in girls, like teenagers, sending out to European magistrates in the 19th century, late 19th century, asking them to register them as men. These are girls, you know, they're called Basuvis. They would say, I'm a Basuvi, register me as a man. This was a thing. This is there in the records. And then you would have men being in homosexual relationships, which I've said, as I've found, like, you know, so much evidence of that. All the records talk about it. But what is really beautiful also is these sorts of queer families, right? You find trans women who are mothers. So they were single mothers also, as well as they would maybe have a partner and have a child. So and this was criminalized too by the British, right? So they could not have children. So they would be taken forcibly away from them.
These are children that they would adopt, they would
Yeah.
bring into their
Yeah.
families. Yeah.
So these were children they would adopt and bring into their families. So you see all of these instances in the northwestern frontier provinces in the archives. There are records which say about these hijra women, about how there's this woman called Gulbadun, this trans woman. And not only was she a mother, she was also like, yeah, she arranged a suitable marriage for her son, you know. But the thing was, the British made it look like, oh, if a trans person has a person in their house, they're trying to make them trans as well. That was why they criminalized the whole thing, which was obviously not true. You know, in all these instances, you can see, right? So those were the moments that and also in courtesan households, sometimes you find same-sex, intimacy between women. Ruth Vanita has done work on this, and other historians have done work on this, where they find that, you know, a lot of courtesans would openly say that I prefer lesbianism to men. So they would just, I mean, imagine that. This is like back then they could just say that, you know. I'm like, I don't want men, I'm post men.
Also, many of them are keeping business and pleasure separate.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so that's the way it was. And so all this was sort of, through the Victorian eye, all this was extremely sort of vulgar and unnecessarily erotic. And so they criminalized, you know. So
as well. So I want to move a little bit back into your way of writing it, you know. So sometimes I'm very afraid to pick up books that academics write, because I'm not an academic myself, and sometimes I find it so hard to connect with all the references that are given, etc. It almost seems like you have to prepare yourself first to read a book, and it's a harder task and a more difficult task. So Sindhu, you are an academic, and yet your book is such a pleasure to read, because it's not that it's dumbed down in any way. I don't mean that at all. In fact, the opposite. What you do is you have historical facts, you have evidences from archives, you have stories from mythologies. You put all that together in a very funny that you are, in a very humorous, tongue-in-cheek kind of style, where the reader is very easily drawn into these stories and is also sort of doing this journey with you almost, it seems like. So, share with us a little bit about the creative writing of this journey, because it comes from your PhD work. If I had known that, I don't know whether I would have picked up the book with so much excitement. I like, oh my God, I have to now go and look up so many more references. Um, so just share a little bit about the writing of the book.
It's funny you mentioned that, because the first time when the editor from Simon and Schuster got in touch with me saying write a book about this, they were like, okay, they said just send me your PhD thesis, or and I sent it to them. Right, they came back in 2 days saying, what the hell is this? Like, what are all these like things? So then I had to really like rewrite the whole thing and send it to them. But yeah, it was like a conversation really that I was having with my editor at Simon and Schuster. So so Mega Mukherjee and I would just sort of talk about it. So it became like a conversational style because of that. But more than that, the other thing was also that when I write nonfiction, even my previous book, Smashing the Patriarchy, is written in such a way that I'm conversing with the reader, because I want the reader to think with me. I'm not telling them anything. I'm not like, oh, look at this, look at that. Like, I want them to sort of come view the archives with me, come see what's going on. Like, what do you think about this? This is what I think. You don't have to agree with me. You think for yourself. This is what's available. Like, and that's what theory ought to be. That's what academia should be doing, because we're not trying to sort of integrate everybody into my cult. I'm just trying to make everyone a thinking individual. So everyone has to be, especially today in the post-fact, post-truth world, all of us have to be critical, right? So that's my goal. So this is which is why I invite the reader to make it sort of more conversational. And the other thing for me was, I did not want this book to be too academic and boring, because my point was to sort of say to the rest of society also, because I do a lot of exposés of heterosexual society in this book. I'm like, what were you guys doing? So which is my fun thing of being like, I mean, what are you even talking about? Who is moral here and who isn't, kind of thing. So, which is why I took that tone of that tongue in cheek thing of like examining all of society, to be like, actually, we are not the weird ones, So that was my
This
point.
is the new normal.
Yeah, this is the new normal. Yeah, this was the normal.
Is the old normal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also am very intrigued by what Sindhu finds in this book, about. So we've talked enough about the British men, but about how British women, once they started coming to India, and I'm sure the other colonies, and what they thought of everything that they saw here, and coming from their own typical Victorian morality and limitations, what did they think of society, and did they write about it? Did they and did any of that influence, like, were the British men also worried that their women would suddenly turn and be like us? So just wondering how the impressions of women held together.
This is the funniest thing for me, because in 1857, women from across the Indian socioeconomic spectrum go fight the British. And when I say fight the British, they fight the British. Your warriors, queens, workers, laborers, wives, widows, everybody. And then by the turn of the 20th century, the English women are saving Indian women from the patriarchs, right? So I'm very curious always to see what happened. Yeah, what happened here. So to talk about the British women who come after 1857, then they started importing their women, because they didn't trust Native women after that. They're like, you're spying on us, we can't trust you. So they start bringing these women. And the first thing that bothers them is how Indian women are dressed, because they're like, okay, this is too much. This is too, too revealing, right?
What were they dressing as?
So this is the thing. Across Indian society, you had gradations, right? If you see in like these, if you see in the courts, you have these, images of noble women with nothing on the top except like a transparent, like a sheer thing covering on the top. It was very normal for women in that time period, in the mid and early 18th century, 19th century, to expose their breasts. It was not considered immoral in that time. But once the British women came, then they considered this to be extremely obviously immoral, right? And they said that you're not respectable woman if you show your breasts. And then they would obviously do this. And then elite women in India started covering up because they wanted to be respectable and seen as respectable. But obviously, again, caste would play into this, because then the caste patriarchs would stop the women who are marginalized or from subalternized communities not to cover their breasts, because that's how they
That's privilege then.
Yes.
Yeah.
So all that comes into play. So this is one of the ways in which, because think about it, this is such a hot country. Why are women wearing so many layers, right? In the first place. So the women come, and then suddenly all this changes. On the other end of the spectrum, they see women in burqas or women completely covered up, and they feel like they're caged birds that need to be, saved. So either way, there's no pleasing. So whatever Indian women are wearing, it's considered something's going on here, something's wrong. And if they're dressing masculine, then that's cross-dressing. So there's nothing is okay, right? So that's with the sartorial sort of change that you see. But even in other ways, so you have all these missionary women coming, they go to Kerala, and they see these matriarchal and matrilineal families where women have polyamorous relationships. And they're saying things like, this is actually a quote from the book where she says, there is, I think the men need to be saved here. The husbands seem to be appendages. The women don't need saving here. This is loose morality. So wherever they go, whatever they see, they're constantly like, what's going on here? Like, they're just offended by everything. So then by the end of the 19th century, all of this changes. Then the reform movement starts. And when the reform movement starts, it's very interesting because, you're on one hand, we've been told that, Indian women were being saved and educated and from all of them, from being whatever. At the same time, the reform movement was also telling women, like, don't go do martial arts. Like, that's not respectable. Like, that's not domestic. Women don't do that. So domesticity was like touted as some ultimate prize. Monogamous marriage and domesticity was the thing. So yeah, so that's what all of these things led to.
So from here I'll move to something that again you talk a lot about in the book. You talk about decolonizing the way we think about our past, and so this word has been very much in a very contentious place in India. The reason is you have uh, one set of people who want us to believe that everything that was here 5,000 years ago was golden and beautiful and there was nothing wrong with it, and we should all go back there. And there is another bunch of post colonial um, decolonizing theorists who talk about a different understanding of decolonization, which is more to do with how we unlearn the way of thinking, being, with the impact of colonization, and what can we sort of forage, what can we bring back from what was there before. Where does your idea of decolonizing stand with respect to queer histories and queer identities when we look at it? How do you define decolonizing? How do you think it might be an important tool that you talk about in the way we look at our histories from the point of view of the present?
I obviously am closer to the latter, not the former.
Yeah.
Because there was no golden past ever,
Yeah. Mm.
not for everybody. And I don't think it was there for anybody, to be honest. But it's to say that, like I said before, it was like people were always resisting these hierarchies that existed. So what we've lost are these memories of resistance. That's what I want to bring back, rather than saying let's go back to some. There was no. And decolonizing is never about going back in time. It's always about going forward in time. And it's about looking at the past through a very critical lens to see how the colonial moment reshaped India, or reshaped Indians in that sense. And the sort of categories that the British brought and sort of told us who we are. It's very funny because all of us decolonists in the UK, we talk about it. Even my friends who are from the African subcontinent and also South Asians, we talk about how the archives have this sort of like this like larger than life thing, right? If the British said it must be true, like as if they are so objective, like there's no subjectivity there, right? Like as if they said it, it's true. So a lot of things in the way they saw us is how we see ourselves now.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we've lost a sense of our own self-possession or like self, way of viewing ourselves. So decolonizing is that kind of a lens
Yeah.
through which you're sort of looking at the past, but looking at how the British saw, your people in a sense, and how we see things now. But to sort of try and get these little gists and little sort of promises or hopes and ideas from the past to sort of imagine a future which is more equitable for all of us.
Yeah.
So I'm not anti-British at all in that sense, right?
Yeah.
I was trained in the British Academy. My friends are all
And you
like,
found all of this in the
yes,
British
yeah, and
archives.
I'm
Yeah.
an Anglophile in that
Yeah.
sense, So it's like, so even though I've written this book, it's not like look at me, like, what am I even talking about, So it's like some people say, like, how can you even decolonize in English? What the hell is that, So there is all these complications, right? So it's never just say that it's about going back to the past. So it's not that, for starters. I have a whole sort of a section in the book because I can't. It's not something I can just define.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. But I think Walter Mignolo says this. It's about really shifting your consciousness.
Yeah.
Trying to find another way of being.
Yeah. And do you think that with all the erasers that have happened over time, there is this book is a book of great hope, and that's also what I like about it so much. That while you're talking about these really haunting ways in which the British tried to control, tried to silence and erase, Sindhu seems to feel that if we look deep enough, even with what we have today, we will find traces, whether they are in songs that people sing, or images we see, or texts we read. There are layers under the layers that were so called erased. And it's almost those impressions can be the first clues for us to get into these histories. So, share with us a little bit, like in as examples, like what are some of these traces that one can hope to stumble onto.
So this is something that I say in the book, and I say all the time. It's like, if you know, you know.
Yeah.
Those who don't know, don't know. So it's like, even though there was this major purge in like in all the literature that happened at that time, some of them slipped through because they didn't even know that that was queer. Like, So, but when you read it, right? And this is also something that I wanted to say about the British women at that time. I will say it now. There is a painting in the book where you see a white woman and a brown woman naked. That's their last day. They're being punished for being in love with each other.
They are in prison. They're that's
prison.
the image. Yeah.
It's called The Victory of Fate.
Yeah.
So that painting is a Christian painting. It's a painting of saints, But if you view it as a queer woman, you know exactly what's going on there, And that painting was made as a kind of caution to say no interracial love between women, because that was also happening. The British women coming to India or other colonies, they were also
There were
falling
like
in that.
multiple transgressions on that. Yeah.
Multiple things happening. So all of these things are happening, right? So when you see a painting, when you see a poem, when you see a folk song, when you see anything, there'll be traces that if you know, you know. And if you dig a little deeper, look a little harder, you'll find it. But those who don't know, they can't, it's, Yeah, so that's the hope that I have. And I found such things, such traces. Sometimes you don't even have to look that hard. Like you see Debonissa's, who's Aurangzeb's daughter. She was a Sapphic Sufi, and she was in love with a Hindu woman. And she wrote such amazing lesbian poetry. And it's like, you don't even have to like imagine, like, you just see it and then like, okay, yeah.
We will open this out to the house soon, but before that, one last question, Sindhu. So this book is as much about the past as it is about the future. And you talk about one of the reasons for writing this book is that queer child who's growing up today thinking that we have no histories, we have no past, where do I look? You hope that something like this can give them things to imagine futures with, imagine new mythologies with. How do you see that happen? Like, how do you see something, not just this book, but conversations around this. How can we make our queer futures imagined as collectives, imagined as more resplendent? How can that happen?
So this is something, thank you for that question, because that's the main aim of it, right? Because growing up, for me, I didn't have anything like this. I just want the kids growing up today to know, you know? So yeah, that's the main aim of this, which is why I've written it also in a way that young people can understand it, like Gen Alpha even. Um, but I think the thing is that the thing about the West also is that they are obsessed with naming everything and categorizing everything, right? So they've gone into over categorizations. So, but like as Madhvi Menon says, desire in India was not always named, it was just felt, you know, and so we don't have to always name ourselves. So going into the future from the subcontinental perspective, from in the Indian perspective, I think we can draw so much beauty from our own cultures in the sense that, you know, how we can see these things, right? Do we have to like come out? Do we have to do like, you know, just live your life, man or woman, or no, like whatever you are, just live your life, like, you know. And those sorts of fluidities that we can actually teach the West about in that sense. Those are the futures that we can reimagine, right? What gender fluidity is, that's so embedded in our culture in the sense that the soul is genderless according to most spiritual ideas in the subcontinent. So these sorts of ideas that are there rooted so deeply, we can draw from that to sort of build the futures and take what, you know, we're taking from all these nomenclatures and categorizations from the West. But that's the hope.
I want to talk about another narrative. You, of course, talked about the colonial British narrative, but there's also the fact that there was the Islamic rule for almost 500 years before the British came in. And from you sort of hinted that there were the Maulvis and all who had a particular view, but then you also had so many other strands of Islam and Islamic culture, Persian, Turkish culture, which came in, and that seemed to be much more, to use a common word, liberal, or you know, the kind of fluidity that you described was probably still very much accepted in that culture. So I want you to link that to what's happening today, where there's again this attempt to sort of see Islam as a very monolithic culture, which is always extremist or orthodox or, you know, highly patriarchal and against any kind of diversity and things. So I think while we are trying to remove ourselves from that British sort of ways and the Victorian morality, perhaps we also need to re-examine how we look at those 500 years and the culture, which I call a composite Indian culture. You know, why are we always dividing it into religious, as you said, categorization and things? So I want you to comment on that.
Thank you for that question. I do talk a lot about that in the book because early modern India was very heterodoxic. In fact, in the archives, you also find this thing that when the British wanted to categorize Indian society for their own benefit, for, you know, to rule and to understand how to rule these people, sometimes families would be Islamic and Hindu in the same family, but then they were allowed to register only one religion as theirs in the paperwork. So everybody was sort of forced to pick a side, you know. So this is the stuff that sort of came with colonization. So yes, you're absolutely right that you find all through the Mughal times, you know, even Razia Sultana was a Delhi sultan who ruled as a sultan and not as a sultana. So you have this long history, you know, with all of these Islamic rulers and the Sufi history that we have. There are so many Sufi saints who were also gender fluid. And Sufi poetry is obviously so queer in its essence. So yes, there is so much beauty there, and there's so much of that the current, you know, political climate is trying to sort of paint in a monolithic way, which is completely absurd because that's not at all how it was. And there was, in fact, there was so much of that, you know. But yeah, I think there is a lot of that in the book, and I hope people do that because that's a very essential thing.
Anyway, I just want to first congratulate both of you for great discussion, and I'm definitely going to get into the book right after this. But my question is, I've written it down so that I don't stumble over it. I assume that India today, I assume it, that is largely a very conservative, religiously moralizing society in a very Brahminical, Catholizing values, like everything should be like this and nothing else kind of thing. It's very deterministic, binary ways of doing it. So when you write a book like this, that is not merely a historic excavation, it also smashes the pretty pillars of the current society, right? You're not just writing history, you are also saying something that will cause trouble if
Trust me, people have been mean to me about it.
exactly, that is literally my question. What kind of pushback and negative press, so to speak, because in the trade of book you need good press, unfortunately, and good press is unfortunately taken over by the current media world, which is not really very broad-minded, let's just say politely. So what kind of pushback do you get from that, and therefore how do you intend to even reach the masses in India if you are not even being just being shut down, so to speak?
I mean, I hope it gets translated, into various languages. That's one way I suppose we can reach various peoples. But I mean, think about it. Honestly, you should give me ideas, because honestly, like, I get flack from the British for doing this. I get flack from everybody for doing this. Like, random aunties and uncles are like hating on me because they're like, "Why are you corrupting society?" So at this point, I don't know. I'm like asking Arundhati, what do I do? So yeah, I mean, honestly, it is sort of questioning a lot of the identities that we have for ourselves and why we think we are the way we are. Are we the way we are? Is this what it really is? And these are very philosophical and very deep questions to ask. So it's not easy for anybody who's been inbred in a particular ideology, say, or in a it's not easy. It's like shaking you up and saying, what, wake up from the dream, and then you're like, what? So it's tough. Yeah. Thank you.
If I may add to this, just that you're right that there's a lot of media that we call Godi media, which is doing what it is doing. But I think the good thing is that there is a lot of pockets of support and solidarity. Look at this room. You haven't had, for so long, we are talking about sex and queerness, and we haven't had anybody walk in asking us to stop. I mean, I think we should also count our blessings, and that each one of us form one of those blessings. And there is a lot of that. We may not see it, it may not be as loud as some of the others, but these spaces are there, these people are there, and we have to help ourselves. We are all of we've got. So
Okay, so the question I have to ask is this, like similar to the Deep South in the USA during the American slave trade, a lot of white masters had both consensual and unconsensual relationships with their slaves, both like straight and homosexual, and a lot of them were forced, like Patsy and Edwin Epps from 12 Years a Slave. Did the British officers have anything like that with Indian servants? Any like forcible physical relationships?
This is the thing, right? This is a very complex history. So there was, of course, both, because in any sort of hierarchical, situation, if say this British officer is having, this relationship with a houseboy, obviously there's a power hierarchy there, and there is all of that playing into it. So yes, there must have been, but there is, I mean, not that I can cite evidence for it. But yes, they must have been. And all of these relationships, you have to sort of look at the power dynamics of this. But what gives me hope also is that in the archives you also find these interesting letters between interracial couples being written to each other, where it's very loving and all of that. So there is, like my daughter would say, 6-7.
Over here. Well, first I just wanted to thank you again for centering this in queer joy. That means a lot. And yeah, I have a lot to unpack and probably cry in my pillow tonight with joy and other feelings too. My question is around how gender shows up in like our Indian languages, because it's always broken my brain. Like, how is X this gender versus, like, it's so binary. And there's obviously, it's not just Indian languages that have that kind of gender bifurcation. And so I'm just curious, like, did you find anything around how that shows up or how that became rigid as well, or other traces of queerness in our native language itself? Thank you.
So this is again something that I think happened with the purge that I was talking about, when people very consciously sort of tried to put their languages into the framework of English, right? Because English is very binary. But what's interesting is that, like, even in Tamil, you have I'm Tamil, so you have avan, aval, avar. Avar is like them, you know. So it doesn't necessarily mean him or her. So sometimes poetry is written like that, and you don't know the gender of the person they're referring to. Same happens with Sufi poetry and with Persian and Urdu poetry, where you can't really tell the gender of the person. So there were these fluidities, and you also find it in folk songs as well. Where there is a Parayan folk song that I quote in the book, and in that the gender changes midway. So by the end of the song, you can't tell if it's a male addressing a female or a female. They both become girls at one point, and they become boy and girl. So there is so much beauty and fluidity in Indian languages. I think we've sort of lost these knowledges, which we need to really dig and find out, because we've, for so long, for like 100 years now, 100 plus years, people have been trying to fit themselves into the binaries of the English language. So we're like sort of translating back. So I hope you find some as well.
Hi. Hi, I'm here.
Sorry, I don't have my glasses.
So sorry. So it was a great conversation. Thank you so much for that. This is not a question, this is almost a comment. And I'm like, I'm asking you to join me in this contemplation right now. So I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration behind the book, which I think Arundhati already covered. But like, what did you read when you were researching about the book? Because you mentioned Madhavi Menon, and I read her book, which is a great book, and it's a great collection of things that people should know about. So that's my first part of the question. And second thing is, I often feel that when you're talking about desire, right, you're talking about acceptance of desire in society and different classes and different sects of society. This is my experience of life and the way I've seen the world. The more we intellectualize ourselves, the more difficult it is for us to accept something which is innately human. All of us are just human beings, and we like and we love each other the way we do, right? So there was a movie that I recently saw. I mean, I recommend that film to everybody if you can see it. It's, I think, available on YouTube. It's called Katla Kari. It's a Gujarati film which speaks about queer love. And it actually talks about a section of society which is, rooted in, villages in India, in Gujarat somewhere, and not very affluent people, definitely not literate people. But the way they accept love between two people is so easily and so regularly. They don't even think about it. They don't intellectualize it. So I wanted to ask you, do you think because we've learned so much, because we are respectable adults and we're these people, we've gotten degrees, do you think it infringes on our ability to accept something which is simple and we overcomplicate it? So yeah, thank you.
That's a nice question, right? Even Arundhati can answer this question. I think you're right. I think overthinking things just complicates everything, right? And this is also something that is going back to what you just said, Madhvi Menon's book, where she talks about desire as something that you don't name, that you just feel. And so it's all right to feel whatever you feel, and intellectualizing it sort of makes it be like, oh, what does this mean? What am I now? Like, have I changed? Do I have to like change my identity and everything now? So yes, there are those complications that arise from it. But I also think that there is some sort of in the current society that we live in, maybe naming things, because we've been, all these ideas have been suppressed for so long, that us intellectually thinking about it can help us all break out of it, for other people as well, if you want to talk about it in those terms and put it out there. So I think there is all of that happening. But yeah, with this book, the you were asking about the inspiration of the desires and stuff, which is the biggest sort of thing I've agonized over, right? Because I'm looking at all these people from the past, because I don't think they may have been wanted to be called any of these terms, right? I mean, I brought them all out of the closet, so to speak, but maybe they didn't want to be in these names or whatever. So it's always a complicated sort of a thing, and I think it's always a very individual journey. It's very subjective to each person and how they handle it.
Like, to add something there, I think it's contextual. It's where you are. If not having a language is equal to silence in the place that you are, then you must have a language. Yeah. And I think I won't call it intellectualization, but sometimes having a language, having words, and speaking about who we are, how we live, how we love is important only because your context is a majoritarian, normalized context. So if I walk into a room, what are you going to think of me as? A woman? Because I look the way I do, right? So if I didn't have a language to tell you that I'm not, that silences my being, right? So I think it's a privilege to say we don't need to intellectualize. It's a privilege to say that because if I come from a typical heteronormative, maybe upper caste, monogamous kind of situation, then my reality is what is understood by most people, is not just as understood, is assumed of everyone. But if I am not that, how do I say it without a language? How do I say I am not you? So I think to that extent, it's important to have language and articulate.
Yourself or anything at all. You empower yourself with knowledge. That's the most beautiful thing. But I also feel that when we read so much and we, get degrees and we travel and we become culturally affluent, we come from a certain class, whatever, I think that's also entitling ourselves, to ask as many questions around us about everything, which is important. I know it's a controversial opinion, it's important. But if somebody who does not have a language for it, right, it'll be easy for them to find those joyous connections with other people in that moment, because you know what, they think it's simple for me. Something simple is more accessible sometimes in comparison to, I don't know. Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. You're in your body more, the way she said it. So I think there's an innate download of your own existence in your body that you get just by being who you are, inhabiting your being completely. And I think that knowledge also has power. That's what I mean.
Of course, knowledge can be so many different things, right? Experiential knowledge is part of that. So yeah, of course.
Hi, I'm Kaveri Myra, and I have been having such a good time the last 2-3 days reading your book. I'm also an academic. I do obstetric violence research. And it's, for those who don't know, it's basically people who give birth getting abused at the hands of care providers in obstetric settings. I'm at a stage in my research where like my mental health is fucked because I do obstetric violence research. And also I've been working on finding hope, on trying to understand what exactly am I looking for in all this research? What should birth spaces look like? Because I mean, these are some of those spaces that have been fully feminine and I mean, top-notch agency, for example. So the last couple of years, I have been drowning in more pleasure and leisure and desire sort of books. So there's so much that I have thematically coded in your book, and I have to read more references. But in my mind, I have always felt the kind of birthing space where, say, if I ever wanted to give birth, I would want to be there, must look very queer. I'm queer myself. But I don't have research yet to support that. But because you have gone into these archives and I see a lot of the self-agency, how it disappeared and why we are where we are. So I'm probably trying to understand if in those archives you found something where you thought birth spaces were beautiful, or something about self-agency, or how pleasure can bring that back and make birthing pleasurable again. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think, that's made me think now. I might go do research on this. But I can tell you 3 things that come to my mind right now. One would be that one of the ways in which sexuality sort of was expressed in that time, right? So say a person was bisexual, say they would have a male partner and a female partner, right? So if they say got pregnant, if they were birthing the child with their female partner, that's a very queer space, isn't it? So there was many such, relationships in that time period. There were also courtesans who were, birthing children and raising them with other women. There's that. There were hijra households again, where they had women that, say a widowed woman with her child would come live with them. They would take them in. These are all there in the archives. And the other thing that came to mind was I've done a lot of research into the dyes, because they were criminalized in the colonial period because they would aid in abortion. And that was considered criminal by the Victorians, right? So these dyes were also women, these were feminine spaces where women could, their agency mattered, whether they wanted to keep a child, not want to keep a child, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, that's another place that you could potentially look at to find these histories. But these are the things that come to mind. But that's a very fascinating thing to research for sure.
Hello. So I was just thinking about how, you were talking about how British women were also, they sort of came into the Indian sphere and then they had their judgments and then they had their engagement as well with people. And I'm just thinking about how that relates to like even the genocide of indigenous Americans and how like white women like they were there's a sort of hypocrisy with the dominant narrative where like they engaged in like sapphic relationships, but then they criminalized and furthered the genocide of like communities that they were against. And like was there so like how have you sort of seen like two sides to it? Like was there a cross communication between these imperialist factions, and was there like similar kinds of resistance that you came across from these spheres? And like I'm just thinking about how all of that is translated to today's world, like because I just see like in a lot of dominant caste families and stuff, like sometimes the men are like very promiscuous and it's not even questioned, it's something that's kept behind closed doors. And then there's judgment on women who who may have like who may have other partners and stuff like that. And how, yeah, just the how have you noticed this hypocrisy, and how have you noticed the resistance and dialogue in relation to that?
I'll start from the last bit first, just about what you said about in this context. In the British context, in that time period, the men could do whatever they wanted because Victorian society was also very misogynist to their own women, right? So white women also suffered a lot. They would be sent to hospitals as hysterical women, or they would be marked as mad and crazy, and they would be locked up in those hospitals and given all those treatments, right? If they were not heteronormative in that sense. So there was also all that happening there. So there's no monolithic thing that you can say that everybody from that particular race or caste or class is, there is always that nuance to look at. But what you're saying really applies, especially with, there was a lot of allyship, obviously, between men and women, British men and women who came into India to civilize Indians, right? Civilize the natives. So in those spaces, you can definitely see how that civilizing happened. But those who often did it were also, in that mindset themselves anyway. So, it's not like they were doing it, but they were not letting these people, they were also not sort of, in that space, in that sense. I've not done a lot of research into First Nations, although I live in Canada. I've not done a lot of research into the First Nations, or I can't give you a comparative sort of analysis. But from the British in India, that is what I can say, that especially with, you see these, you can see it across, though. It's like, I wouldn't say it's just the missionaries, because it is a very government, the state was also doing it, and the state and it was also helped by Brahmanical patriarchy and the Islamic patriarchy. Everyone sort of, I have a line in the book where I say all the fundamentalists banded together, to purify Indian society. And that's what happened. I hope that helps.
Hi. So just to give a small context, I've been extremely curious about desire, the chemistry of connections, what attraction is for quite many years. And my background has been coming from more ecology, conservation, land-based work, to then interrelational work, to now like sexology and intimacy, somatic intimacy specifically. And just to give a side note, India Birth Village in Kerala is a place you may want to look up. Okay, okay. I'm very curious about your book. I'm gonna go read it. Something that I wanted to connect with some of the points and conversations was around pleasure and how to separate a people from each other in the land. A quick and severing way to do it is to cut a relationship with the body and pleasure. And there's so much in what I have learned and what I know that I'm constantly excited to like share. But one of the main things is the way that someone moves through the world. You can either intellectually move with an idea, or in various cultures, no, it's the tandem or the source of where your energy comes through, and to be comfortable to move through the world through this part of your body versus your head. And the thing to trust spontaneity from the lower part of your body is not what most people do, because there's suppression, repression, trauma. You don't trust this part of your body. So there's so much we have to undo to learn how to then deeply connect with the root of our body to move through the world. So desire, and this thing even about lust, the difference between lust and sensuality and pleasure. And lust is a force that will come through because we're not connected. But if we were more connected to sense and feel pleasure from even the most delicate things and the nuances of the shapes of love, or the thing of seeing the light in someone else's eyes, and that's not specific to a tailored version of what you think it is, but you're feeling it. So yeah, just to share that. And I'm so curious about this book, and I'm excited to read it. Thank you for the work you do.
I'm over here. Thank you for this beautiful opportunity to hear about your truly fascinating work. I have a very practical question. Of course, Simon & Schuster will want you to sell books, and I understand it's a business, but I think it's so immensely valuable. So my question is there any plan or strategy with all the communication tools that are available now to bring this to people who are not or no longer in the habit of going to a bookshop and get a book that contains all this amazing information?
I should, consult the marketing at Simon & Schuster for this. But to be honest, I've always depended on word of mouth, that somebody I speak to would go tell somebody else about it. And that's how all my books have sold so far in my life. Like, I've not done this major PR thing or whatever. It's like talking in spaces like this where I trust that you would go tell somebody about it. And, but if you have any ideas, please text me. I have no idea, honestly. There are people who never buy a book. I mean, it's true. Some people have suggested I make it into a video game so it would reach more people. That might be a fun thing to do. Yeah. But thank you. I'll think about this.
Yeah, so copies of the book are available right outside. If you would like to pick up, and Sindhu will sign it for you. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Just a more open-ended, like, what's next? What are you excited about? And where is your desire leading you?
Is that about me? Oh, no. I never answer personal questions. But it's too complicated. But my next project, honestly, is that I've been working on, because I've started this archival research. What I also found when I was doing this archival research was about all these forgotten feminisms in India. We've been told the story of women being eternal victims in India, right? But I found so many women across time, because my research was in early modernity. And then I was like, oh my God, women across the socioeconomic spectrum are resisting. So then let me go back a little bit more in time, and then a little bit more in time. And I just found so much. So I have all of that written up. But I'm, mainly a fiction writer. So, and I write a lot of poetry about desire. That's one place I'm like honestly writing about my desire. So if you wanted to read that, you could read my poetry. But I'm hoping to write more like fiction going forward. It's very hard because after all this nonfiction, you just want to break, you know? So yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sindhu, for taking us through this book. It's an incredible read, really. And you will want to read it many times. So big applause for you. Yeah. And thank you.
And thank you so much for all the lovely questions and to the lovely audience as well.
Thank you so much for patiently listening to us, Sindhu, and for asking these questions, having this discussion. Thank you so much.